Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. In this video I'm going to be sharing my process in drawing this beautiful red-winged blackbird drawn in coloured pencil. This piece was drawn using Faber-Castell polychromos pencils and it was drawn on graphics drafting film. This is a surface I haven't used too much of in the past, just a few pieces here and there, but it really is a beautiful surface to work on and I've got lots of tips throughout this video about using this surface. It's got some really great qualities for coloured pencil work and I look forward to sharing them in this video. So here you can see me getting started with the eye, which is the part of the body that I always start with when drawing birds. I've spoken about bird eyes in many tutorials in the past, so I'm not going to go into too much detail with that today. But the main thing is to remember to keep a nice sharp point to capture the correct size and the shape of the eye. So a little about drafting film. This surface is super smooth and non-porous, which means it doesn't have any tooth. And that also means that your coloured pencils sit on top of the surface rather than sinking in. So because of that, we build light controlled layers instead of heavy pressure, or it doesn't even take multiple layers. Drafting film is amazing for building crisp details, strong contrast, and also a real beautiful luminous smooth look, which is so much easier to achieve than on paper. So with that being said, that brings me to tip number 1 when using drafting film, and that is to make sure that you're working on a smooth surface underneath the film. Because the film is quite thin, absolutely anything can get underneath it. Even the tiniest speck of dust will show up as soon as you start drawing over the top, and then it's really hard to eliminate any blemishes, and before you know it you've ruined the whole clean glossy look. So before you start, double check that the area underneath is completely clear, and I also recommend completely taping your surface down on all 4 sides of your paper to avoid anything getting underneath it. And that is really useful when using an eraser because eraser debris is very cheeky and likes to get everywhere. So back to the blackbird, and you can see I've got started here by blocking in the structure of those layers of feathers in the bird's head, and I'm just basically pushing my black polychromos pencil backwards and forwards in a zigzaggy sort of motion just to build up the basic structure of those. And you'll see soon enough why drafting film is so great for this style of working. We don't have to be too concerned about the detail or the preciseness at this point. I'm just blocking in basic shapes. And here I'm moving on to the feather direction and the rest of the head, just making sure that the pencil strokes are all in the direction of the feathers. So tip number 2 when it comes to drafting film is to make sure that your surface underneath is as smooth as possible. You may think that a sheet of paper is fine, and in most cases it is okay, but if you really want that flawless smoothness, you really need something closer to glass, and that is what I actually use. I use a pane of glass from an old picture frame, which is all nice cleaned and polished up, and it's perfect for giving the drafting film a super smooth even base. So for the next part of the bird, I'm simply glazing over, which is just shading my pencil backwards and forwards, over the top of those feathers that I've just drawn in. I'm using a dark indigo pencil for this because I really want to amplify those cool blue shadows on the right hand side of this bird. The blackbird is sitting in a really beautiful sunlit setting, so I wanted to take advantage of the light and explore different tones of black in the shadows and the highlights. So for this shadowed area on the right, I wanted to introduce some cooler blue tones to help bring out some more depth and contrast. And I also feel that this approach just helps the bird to feel a little bit more 3D and natural. It also helps to give the feathers some more richness and subtle variation rather than using black and grey alone, which can make a drawing appear flat. And then likewise for the sunlit areas on the left, I've introduced a little bit of brown, which you can just see there just below the beak. So something else I love about drafting film is the ability to pull out really tight details, which you can see here on the top of the head for those splayed out feathers. I'm using a really sharp point, but the drafting film really helps to make them nice and crisp. So here I'm simply going over the area with another layer, applying just a little bit more pressure to amplify the contrast and make the darks a little richer. So this brings me to my next tip for drafting film, and that is to avoid pressing too hard. Because the surface is non-porous and really smooth, it can only hold a limited number of layers before the pigment starts to just sit a little bit unevenly and skid across the film, so to speak. So instead of applying heavy pressure, you need to build your darks up gradually with multiple light layers, and that just helps to maintain that smoothness and keeps the colours nice and vibrant. So now we're moving on to pulling out some highlights and tiny specks of subtle light in the feathers. I'm using a craft knife here to gently scrape away the pigment, which is another huge advantage of drafting film. Because the surface is really smooth and non-porous, coloured pencil pigment lifts and scrapes away really cleanly. So this helps to leave the area underneath really clear and crisp before pulling out those highlights. You can also use a kneaded or electric eraser for softer highlights or delicate touches. They both work really beautifully on this surface without damaging it. And it's this quality which I personally absolutely love about drafting film, being able to pull out those fine feather details and tiny little reflections or subtleties. It's so much easier to achieve than on paper. But the key is to work lightly and deliberately so you preserve that smooth finish. It's easy to go really heavy with an eraser or a craft knife, so just make sure that you maintain a nice light touch. So here you can see me going back in with some darker colours to shade over some of those highlights that I've just pulled out. So when you pull out highlights on drafting film, each little scrape takes you right back to the base surface colour, which can sometimes be a little bit too bright for what you need. So not every highlight should stay at that strength, so to speak. So that's why you'll see me going over here with a very light touch of a dark pencil, just enough to soften those highlights and blend them into the shadows. So moving on to the body now, and I'm starting to bring in some browns for those sunlit areas, and then gradually mixing in some blues as we move towards the shadows. And all the time I'm keeping my pressure really light, so to build up lots of light layers. Just bringing in a little dark sepia to start building up some of the feather structure. And then more light layers in the feathers to start building up some more depth and contrast. So here I'm starting to use my craft knife again to pull out some, not necessarily highlights, but some of the markings in the blackbird's feathers. So like I mentioned earlier about pencils appearing really crisp on drafting film, the same can happen when you use a craft knife. It can give you those ultra sharp highlights, which is great for certain textures, but sometimes you may want something a little softer, and that's where an electric eraser or a kneaded eraser is more beneficial. So they lift the pigment a little bit more gently and give you that softer, more natural highlight, which you can see me doing here with my electric eraser. I'm just tapping the eraser really, really gently. There's hardly any pressure on the surface there at all, and it just lifts the colour rather than scraping it away, which I think works really beautifully for those highlights on these feathers. And then more tinting of those highlights and building up further layers. Here I'm just softening some of my highlights with a white pencil, just going over some of those scraped edges. Again, this brings in a little bit more softness. And moving further down the body, I'm starting to build up some of those warm sunlit colours on the left, and then gradually move into those cooler colours on the right. For these layered feathers, I started by outlining the edge of each feather and then started to block in with some dark indigo. Just pushing my pencil backwards and forwards, using light layers to slowly build up that smoothness and the depth. And then I amplified the shadows of each feather with a really light pressure of black before going in with my craft knife and white pencil to pull out some of those highlights. And then just a little refining before I repeated a similar process for the wing feathers. And here I'm just adding further highlights to the tips of each feather. It's a really satisfying process to do in this drawing. And because of the way the sunlight is catching the bird, it creates these really beautiful subtle highlights throughout the feathers. And when those highlights sit right next to the deeper shadows, I think that the contrast gives the whole piece so much more depth, and it almost makes the blackbird feel a little bit more alive. And the tail feathers here are very similar, just a few more deeper shadows, a few more subtle highlights. And of course, I want to make sure that the sunlight is really amplified on those tail feathers. So I'm introducing more of the raw umber and some cooler, richer brown tones. And because of the way the evening sun is highlighting those brighter feathers, it's casting some really dark shadows on the opposite side. So I'm contrasting that with plenty of blue. So if you would like to follow along to the full real-time tutorial, everything's all in real time, nothing is sped up or missed out. I do have this over on my Patreon channel. The full class is about just under 4 hours, and I talk you through everything as I go. And you can find that along with many more tutorials. I have over 100 on there now, so lots to get stuck into. If that is of interest to you, then the link is in the description box. So I kind of saved the best till last on this piece. I wanted to get all the dark colours done first before I started working on that really bright pop of colour. So I started by blocking out the shadows first, and then I started to introduce some lighter colours for the sunlit areas. So I've got some cinnamon here, which I'm just shading over the top of those shadows. And then I started to warm up some of those tones with some deeper oranges and reds. I've got some dark cadmium orange here, as well as some deep red. And also caput mortuum violet as well. And then for the yellow parts, I didn't want these to be too bright, so I went with some light yellow ochre for that almost sunlit effect, and then a touch of raw umber for some subtle shadows in the yellow. So apart from a little bit of tweaking and refining, tidying up, that sort of thing, this piece is just about wrapped up. So the main thing in this piece for me has been to capture that beautiful light on the left and to contrast it with those richer, cooler blue tones on the right. And I feel as though the surface, the drafting film, has really helped to amplify those colours. Drafting film is great for really saturating colours as long as you maintain a light pressure and don't go too heavy with your highlights. Leave all the tiny textured details until later on. And another way of amplifying and saturating the colour even further is to flip the drafting film over and just apply a little bit of layering on the back as well. I haven't done this in this particular piece, but it is an option that you could do if you wanted to do that. And one final tip is to use a sheet of paper underneath your hand when drawing on drafting film. It's really easy to smudge your pencil pigment on drafting film. So just adding a spare sheet of paper underneath your hand will just help to avoid that. It won't eliminate it completely. You will have to go over with an eraser at the end just to remove some very subtle smudges, but it will help massively. So I'm just about wrapping up this drawing and tutorial now. So I hope you have enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Bye.